We are going to start this video on page 10 of your notes handout, so flip to that page. And you can also bring your homework to bear here as well. Newton, in the late 17th century, seemingly described the functionings of the entire physical universe through mathematics. And this is obviously a major contribution to the scientific revolution. And philosophically, it will have a couple of important effects. In terms of Newton's scientific contribution, essentially what he lays out here are a series of natural laws by which it makes it seem as though the universe works in a very predictable and orderly way. So as it regards, let's say, the heliocentric theory, although this would apply to any facet of the universe in terms of Newton's laws of gravity and laws of motion, it's the gravitational pull and laws of motion that have the Earth rotating around the sun in a very predictable, very steady manner, have the Earth continuing to rotate on its axis, making the sun rise and set, that axis at a tilt according for the coming and going of the seasons. And Newton is able to describe all of these physical phenomenon through mathematics by inventing calculus. So he describes essentially nearly an entire summary of the physical functionings of the universe, and does so through mathematics. This is going to have two major effects. One, it is going to make the physical world seem a little bit less personal to a number of people in terms of human beings' relationship to God. You had the traditional understanding that every physical phenomenon, every natural phenomenon was God's constant active hand and involvement in creation, bringing about natural phenomenon that sustained humanity. Some people are going to draw conclusions off of Newton's work to say that the world is essentially working like a machine. It's just kind of running on its own. And therefore, for some people, they arrive at the conclusion that nature is not as sacred as it had once been considered. Now, certainly not everybody will arrive at that conclusion. Newton himself was aghast by the conclusions drawn here. He had accounted for God's continued involvement, but the extrapolation, kind of the popular conclusions that are drawn off of Newton's work are summarized in part by kind of Spinoza's saying here. And he says, look, Newton has shown us that the Earth is just kind of rotating around the sun on its own according to mathematical physical laws. So Spinoza philosophically goes on to conclude that, quote unquote, there is no need to show at length that nature has no particular goal in view, and that final causes, this is the traditional belief that God acts through nature, are mere human figments. For some people, like a Spinoza figure, it leads them to conclude that God is not particularly involved in the functionings of the physical world. Instead, everything is just running according to consistent, predictable physical laws that can be described through mathematics. And this, of course, is going to be, for many people, a much colder kind of a situation than God's constant involvement. Casaubon will be a critic of Spinoza, and this will always be the religious critique of science. Essentially, you can read the quote here, but essentially what he's saying is that people through the scientific lens are looking too narrowly at the physical world, and they're losing the big picture of the spiritual dimension of existence. They're getting down so into the weeds of physical existence through science that they're losing the larger picture. The other major effect beyond this desacralization is that you also simultaneously have this huge boost in a belief in human capability. You have this towering figure of Newton, this genius, who has seemingly spelled out essentially the entire functionings of the physical universe. So for some people, this is a demonstration that scientific thought is rightfully to be followed, to the exclusion of religion, traditional religious authority, tradition, etc. You have this huge boost in confidence in human intellectual capabilities, and that is on the shoulders of Newton's monumental accomplishment. Thinkers going forward into the 18th century will point to Newton as a source of ongoing inspiration regarding human intellectual capabilities as a whole. Now, let's take a look at the 11th page. And as you flip to the 11th here, at the very top you see a headline that Newton and Locke are the founding fathers of the Enlightenment movement. Newton unwittingly, kind of against his will, because a number of his conclusions are taken well beyond what he intended people to take away from them. Locke a little bit more directly, and we're going to spend the rest of the time talking about the influence of these two thinkers on the 18th century Enlightenment. You've got a paragraph there at the top of the page, and you should read that paragraph. Pause the video here and read that paragraph. And when you come back, here's kind of what we're talking about, and you can jot this down towards the bottom of the page then. The 18th century Enlightenment, essentially what the 18th century Enlightenment is, the way it's different from the 17th century scientific revolution, is it's scientific thought, and it prioritizes scientific thought. It's not going to look to tradition. It's not going to look to traditional authority as an intellectual starting place. It's not going to look to scripture as an intellectual starting place. But it is going to apply science beyond scientific thought, I should say, beyond simply endeavoring to understand the physical world. It will also apply instead scientific thought to understanding human beings, human nature, and towards the understanding of human society. It will be scientific thought applied to humans and their societies. So once especially you get into the application of scientific modes of thought beyond to human society, obviously you're well beyond the application of scientific thought to just the physical world. Here are the contributions of Newton that are, and he doesn't intentionally contribute these to the Enlightenment, but that are picked up upon, seized upon by the 18th century Enlightenment thinkers and applied forward into their thought. Again, Newton, an unwitting, in many regards, unwilling contributor to the Enlightenment. Newton being a devout Christian and horrified by some of the conclusions that people drew from his findings. Nonetheless, here are some thoughts that are extrapolated out of Newton's finding. First, the functioning and nature of the physical world can be understood through consistent and universal laws. So that is something that people believe Newton had done in his Principia Mathematica, that a human being had explained essentially the entire physical functionings of the world. Two, and here's where you start to see the extrapolations well beyond Newton's original findings. Therefore, human beings must be consistent and orderly, just like there are universal laws for all physical matter and its functionings through gravity and the laws of motion. Human nature must be according to universal laws, and therefore the belief that human beings are similarly orderly, predictable, and similarly understandable. And that's the last part. Human beings can arrive. This is the belief that human beings can arrive at universal truths and natural laws about themselves through scientific thought. So Newton gives this huge boost in confidence in terms of human beings' ability to understand. If human beings can understand the physical functionings of the universe, then it's also the belief that they can understand themselves. If the physical universe functions according to predictable, orderly laws, then human beings must function according to predictable, orderly laws as well. So these are the few major extrapolations from Newton's findings that are applied in Enlightenment thought. Now, let's take a look at the 12th page. And what you have on the 12th is Locke's contribution. So let's take a look at John Locke. One thing to note, maybe at the very top of page 12, Locke and Newton's work came out in very close proximity to each other. I think Newton's work coming out about 3 years sooner than Locke's. So it's the combination. Enlightenment thought is based off of the synthesis that Enlightenment thinkers derive from the works of these two individuals. One in the physical sciences, one in the social sciences. So the Enlightenment thinkers are going to be applying scientific thought, and they're going to be looking to reason and experimentation first and foremost, and Enlightenment thinkers are not going to be looking to tradition and traditional religious basis for their understandings about human beings, for their understandings about human nature, for their understandings about how society should be ordered and structured. And that's where Lockean thought comes in dramatically. As you can see on the page here, Locke is arguing philosophically and as a social scientist, he's not accepting traditional understandings of human beings and human nature. His outlook is that human beings, he comes up with essentially an entirely new outlook philosophically. He says human beings are a tabula rasa, meaning a blank slate. Locke believed that generally human beings were pretty reasonable and pretty good. But fundamentally what Locke believed was human beings are shaped by their environment. They're malleable. They're molded by their environment. The belief that human beings are malleable can be shaped and aren't born bad, but shaped by their environment, their education, and their society. We take this for granted, essentially. You can see how influential Locke's philosophical thought is here. And, you'd point to an example such as the following. You put a child, and let's say you've, hypothetically have the same child, and you put them in two very different environments. Let's say you put a child in a thriving school, or you put that exact same child in a failing school. You're going to get, Lockean thought says, two very different outcomes for that child based on the environment that you place them in. Because Locke says human beings are a blank slate, like a blank canvas, upon which the environment writes itself, imprints itself upon them. So if you put a child in a really good and positive home environment, you're going to get, or a really good and positive school environment, you're going to get better results. You put a child in a really bad, let's say, school and or home environment, you're going to get relatively negative results. And this is all predicated off of the belief in the blank slate. So Locke believes that human beings are shaped by nurture. And maybe you've heard that notion before, the nature versus nurture debate. Lockean thought is the basis of the argument that human beings are shaped by nurture if you put human beings in a better environment. If you put human beings in a better society, the belief is you are going to get better human beings. And that's what Locke is arguing here. Take a look at the second paragraph on the page. Locke believed, as stated in an essay concerning human understanding, which came out about 3 years after Newton's Principia Mathematica, Locke's quote here, "The almost universal unhappiness of man and of nations arises from the imperfections of their laws. Therefore, Enlightenment thinkers and Locke himself extrapolate from there, if you reform society and make society better, that means you're putting human beings in a better environment. If you reform society towards perfectibility by human beings' intellectual ability of reason, then you can shape human beings towards becoming better. What Enlightenment thought believed, you put human beings in a more perfect environment, you're going to get more perfect human beings because it's the environment that shapes humanity. It's not their very nature. It is the nurture or lack thereof of the environment that results in the outcomes of what human beings are like and how they act and how they behave, etc. So the basis of Enlightenment thought that's derived from Locke, again, Locke was he was a 17th century thinker. He's a bridge, he's a founding father to the Enlightenment, but what the Enlightenment thinkers got out of Locke is a combination between Newton and Locke. They said, first, what they got out of Newton, we can arrive at new understandings about human beings. We can arrive at deeper understandings about human beings, and then these can be applied towards the positive reform of society. And if, based on these new understandings about human beings, they had confidence that they could do this because of Newtonian physics, demonstrating consistent and orderly laws that seem to govern the entire universe, they believed in human capability to apply these understandings towards the positive reform of society, and with societal improvement, the positive reform of society, then the belief that you're going to get a better type of human being. So the 18th century Enlightenment, in summary, and you can jot this down on page 12 or page 11, wherever you think you have the most space, but from Newton, and this is kind of like a curt summary, if you will, Newton gives Enlightenment thinkers belief in their intellectual capabilities. Newton's findings about the predictability of the universe give human beings confidence that they are similarly predictable and consistent as the physical workings of the universe. And it gives them confidence that they can understand their fundamental nature, the universal, the natural laws that govern human beings, the same way Newton understood the natural laws that governed the physical world. And then the combination that we talked about, and this synthesis is the foundation of Enlightenment thought. If we understand ourselves really well, which the Enlightenment thinkers believed that they could, then we can apply that towards making a better society. And with a better society, because of the belief in the blank slate, the belief of the Enlightenment is we're going to get better human beings. The overarching belief, obviously, it's based on a number of different beliefs, but kind of the cumulative summary belief of the Enlightenment is the belief that human beings can affect their own progress. That through their intellectual capabilities of reason and experimentation, and because they believe they were blank slates, the Enlightenment thinkers believed that they could affect their own progression. Now, again, either on the 11th or 12th page, you want to jot down this additional component. The Enlightenment is considered to be the beginning of modern times. Historians look at pre-modern versus modern, and the Enlightenment is considered to be the tipping point to modern times. So here we enter into the modern outlook. And the modern outlook or modern belief is based on a few pillars, and we're going to talk about these now in summary, and we're going to go more in depth into these into the coming days. One, modern thought is secular. The Enlightenment thinkers that are building off of and combining Newtonian and Lockean thought are secular thinkers. They're not making reference to traditional religious authority. They're not making reference to scripture. They're seeing the world through a scientific lens of reason and observation and experimentation. Another hallmark of modern times is a higher level of faith in humanity than it had ever existed before, the belief that human beings can affect their own progress. Additionally, there is a belief in reform, even going back to Locke. And Lockean thought calls for the necessity of reform. One piece that you probably should get down on the 12th, ideally, is that not only did Locke say that human beings are a blank slate, but therefore his derivative thought was reform of human society is necessary. So what Locke and then the later Enlightenment thinkers are going to call for is dramatic reform of human society. That we shouldn't, that reform and improving and perfecting human society is going to produce greater and greater outcomes in terms of improving and perfecting humanity. And then the overriding belief system, one of the major additional differences between pre-modern and modern outlooks is the belief in progress. The Enlightenment thinkers come to believe so greatly in human capability and human capability to understand themselves and understand the universal laws that supposedly apply to humanity and human nature and the ability to positively reform society, that Enlightenment thinkers came to believe that human beings are the determinant force and factor in human history, and that through their capabilities and efforts, humanity will take itself to new heights. This is very different than pre-modern thought. Pre-modern thought saw God as the driving force of human history, that it is God's gift of free will to humanity, God's guiding hand, God sustaining humanity and helping humanity and caring for humanity. That was the guiding force behind human history. The Enlightenment thinkers see human beings unto themselves. And here we go back to the notion, the Western notion of individualism. Part of individualism had to do with a feeling of independence or self-reliance. And in this regard, you have a level of secular individualism. The belief that human beings completely unto themselves, without any reference to the divine care, divine help, etc., will not only maintain themselves, but progress themselves in an almost indefinite manner. And we'll talk about that more in the coming days. Now, the last piece to set us up for the homework assignment is take a look at page 13. Here we connect now to the first of the Enlightenment thinkers that we're going to be studying, and that's Diderot on the 13th page. Diderot was a leading philosopher, and you want to make sure you know this term. The Enlightenment thinkers referred to themselves as philosophes. One way to define philosophe is these are the Enlightenment intellectuals, the Enlightenment thinkers. But another way you want to make sure you know how to define it, the term philosophe means free thinker. And the Enlightenment thinkers selected this term very intentionally. Because remember, in terms of their outlook, they're not going to be looking to tradition and traditional religious authority in Scripture. They are going to be looking to their own reason, their own observation and experimentations. So this notion of philosophe, a free thinker, this speaks to the level of intellectual independence that they're feeling from tradition. And when Diderot says all things must be examined, what he's calling for is every single last tradition, every single last traditional norm, value, belief, practice, system, etc., in all of human society, in all of Western civilization, to be questioned. He says we can't take anything for granted. And this is where you get the principle of doubt as well. But this is doubt applied beyond the field of science to human society. Don't believe anything unless it can be proven to be true. So every traditional belief, practice, and norm, Diderot is going to argue, should be questioned. And this is based on the Enlightenment thought that traditional society can be improved upon. And we heard about that in Descartes and Bacon. They said, don't look to tradition for understanding of the physical world, look to reason and experimentation. What Diderot is arguing is, in terms of how to organize human society, all the beliefs, all the systems, all the orders, all the traditions, do not start with tradition. Do not believe anything unless it can be proven. This is supposedly scientific thought applied to human society. So what you're going to have, Diderot and the other Enlightenment thinkers, they're going to question every single norm, value, system, order, practice, tradition in the entire Western tradition in terms of how society is organized and how society is run. And therefore, you're going to get a huge program of proposed reform to move away from traditional society. And this is based on the belief, the modern pillar of thought, that moving away from tradition will lead to progress. Their argument is if we move away from traditional society, we're going to put humanity in a better environment based on Lockean thought. We'll be able to do so effectively because Newton has shown us our intellectual capabilities, and we will get greater results. That moving away from traditional society will lead to the progression of human beings and human society.